I'm Steve Ricker, the Director of Interpretation for the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association, and I'm going to share a story with you guys today of the Over Mountain Men, the Battle of Kings Mountain. I'm going to do it in first-person interpretive programming, like somebody that was actually at the battle. So I'll get started. My name is Thomas Morgan. I was born in the Shenandoah Valley up in Virginia, and as I grew, we had moved down into the Piedmont of North Carolina. And by the time I became a man with a family of my own, I'd become quite the hunter. Problem was, game was getting scarce. It was hard to provide for my family. I had heard about a few venturous men that had crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains over into the Cherokee territory, men like William Bean, James Robinson, and they came back with tales of game that was so thick you could hunt all day. They came back with tales of the ground that was so rich you could drop a grain of corn and it would grow right there. And I had heard later on that people had went over the mountain against the rule of King George III and started settling, leasing land from the Cherokees, making treaties with the Cherokee. And I've got to tell you, this really appealed to me. In 1774, I talked the wife into going. We packed up the young'uns and what we could carry on a horseback, crossed over the top of the Blue Ridge down into the Watauga Valley, and sure enough, folks had started settling there. I'd heard about a man named Jacob Brown that had opened a trading post on the Nolichucky River. Went and got a fine piece of land from this man. And we worked day and night, clearing, building a cabin, planting crops. But you know, for the first time in my life, I was free. Wasn't living under the rule of King George III. We were on the edge of the world and we were totally free. But like every other man that had crossed those mountains, I joined the militia. Served under Colonel John Sevier, Nolichucky Jacks, what we called him. And they used us to protect the settlements from hostile Indian raids. They used us to build roads, to build barns. And in 1776, we had quite a bit of problem with the Cherokee. But we had heard about a man by the name of George Washington that took a stand against the British up north. But I gotta tell you, that war seemed a lifetime away from us. We were on the edge of the frontier. We didn't think it'd even affect us, but we were wrong. By 1780, the war had been dragging out up north for 5 years, and King George was getting tired of it. He wanted to put an end to this revolution. So Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of the British forces, came up with an idea. They called it their Southern Strategy. He loaded his army up on ships, sailed down the East Coast, laid siege to Charleston, Savannah, all the big ports in the South. Their plan was to raise an army of loyalists, to train them in the British coat of arms, march his army over the Carolinas, catch George Washington between these two armies, put an end to the revolution. Their plan was working rather well. Seeing that his plan was working, Sir Henry Clinton sailed back to New York, and he left in charge of all the Southern British forces Major Lord Charles Cornwallis. Now, he had two officers working under him, a man by the name of Bannister Tarleton, one by the name of Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson's job was to protect his western flank and to raise an army of loyalists, Americans just like us, but they were still loyal to King George. He was going to train them, and he was raising quite the army. But in the meantime, some of the Patriot leaders on this side of the Blue Ridge had took a stand against the British, men like Charles and Joseph McDowell, Elijah Clark, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and the British armies would be encamped. There would be a whole group of frontiersmen come out of the woods, lay into them, inflicting casualties, and then disappear right back into the mountains. And they couldn't catch them. This became quite an aggravation for Ferguson. His army was camped at a place called Musgrove Mills, and there was a band of screaming frontiersmen come out of the woods, inflicted casualties, and disappeared one more time into the mountains. Ferguson had had enough. He had captured a young man by the name of Samuel Phillips, and he sent young Samuel back over the mountains with a message for all us, the over mountain men, he called us. And this is the message he sent to us. He told us to lay down our arms, pledge loyalty to King George, or he would march his army over the mountain. He would lay waste our homes and crops with fire and sword, and he would hang our leaders. He made a mistake. As soon as that threat came over the mountain to Colonel Isaac Shelby, he contacted his good friend Colonel John Sevier, and they began to call up the militias. We didn't know it at the time, but they had contacted Colonel William Campbell up in Southwest Virginia about helping us. All I know was I was behind my cabin laying up wood for the winter. My neighbor come riding up, said, "Get your rifle, get your horse. They're calling up the militia." I said, "Why? We ain't had trouble with the Cherokee in a long time." He said, "No, it's the British." He told me of this threat and my blood was boiling. I saddled my horse, got my rifle, my bag and horn, kissed my wife goodbye, and as we rode up the Nolichucky River toward Colonel Sevier's place, they were men coming out of every holler. We were swarming like yellow jackets. Everybody was mad. By the time we got to the colonel's place, there were 240 of us. We cut up Cherokee Creek, headed to Fort Watauga because it was agreed that's where we'd meet. We come riding into Fort Watauga. Colonel Isaac Shelby was there with 240 men from the Holston. About an hour later, here come Colonel William Campbell with 200 Virginians. A couple hours later, here come his cousin Arthur Campbell with 200 more Virginians. Our army was growing. As we camped on the banks of the river that night, there were campfires as far as your eyes could see. I had no idea what we were going to do. The commanders that got together at the fort made a decision. They said, "Ferguson, he wants a fight. Well, let's give him one. But we won't fight him over here in our cornfields around our family. We'll take it to him." Now, the next morning, we were getting prepared to leave. There was a young lady by the name of Miss Mary Patton. She made some of the finest gunpowder you could ever hope to get. She brought us in 500 pounds of quick burning gunpowder. As we're getting ready to mount our horses, there was a young Presbyterian minister, a man by the name of Samuel Doak. He stepped up and he delivered a sermon and a prayer, told us to go fight with the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and that became one of our battle cries. As we began to ride out from the fort, we was driving some cattle for provision. It began to rain. We got to the bottom of the mountain, place that the old people call the resting place. We called it the Shelving Rock. It's a big rock overhang. So we put all of our powder under that rock overhang at night to keep it dry in the rain. Laid out in the field in the rain. Got up the next morning, realized that we couldn't drive the cattle over the mountain, so we slaughtered what we could carry, sent the rest back. We took to the saddle that morning and headed straight up the mountain where the trail crossed over. A place called the Yellow Mountain Gap. You know, by the time we got to the top of Yellow Mountain, the rain had stopped because it had turned to snow. We camped there that night on top of the mountain. It's the most miserable night I can remember in years. The wind was howling, snow blowing. I got up the next morning. I remember looking across the Watauga Valley, thinking, will I ever see this again? Because we all knew we was riding against the most powerful army in the world. We knew our chances were slim. We done a little drilling that morning, took a roll call. Two of Colonel Sevier's men were missing, a man by the name of Chambers and Crawford. We figured that these men were loyalists and that they had deserted to ride ahead to tell Ferguson this over mountain army was on its way. And that's exactly what they did. But then we had a problem because on the other side of Yellow Mountain, there were two trails that went off into the Piedmont. And we knew if we took one trail, Ferguson might be marching his army up the other. He would ride straight into the fort. We couldn't stop him. So they decided to split our forces, something seldom done. Colonel Campbell took his men, took one trail. Colonel Sevier and Shelby took the rest of us. We took the other. We come off the mountain with no sign of Ferguson. Come riding into a plantation, a place called Quaker Meadows. It was a plantation owned by one of our Patriot leaders, Colonel Charles McDowell. Now, we come riding in there in the pouring rain, and the McDowells were so gracious to us. They let us take a top rail off the fence, burn it in their fires trying to dry out, brought in a little corn trying to feed us. And as we sat there in the rain that afternoon, here come a whole group of men riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina. They were being led by a Major Winston and a great big man named Benjamin Cleveland. Now, I'd heard of Ben Cleveland. He was notorious for hanging loyalists. If you was loyal to King George and you run into Ben Cleveland, that would be the last thing you remember. Our army was growing. Now, as we sat there that night in the pouring rain, some scouts came in. They had found Ferguson, camped a few days' ride from us, a place called Gilberttown. We got up that morning, and all the commanders had met under a big oak tree. Because, see, there was a lot of militia. Every militia had its own colonel. And they had all met under this oak tree to make a decision, because all of our colonels were from North Carolina, with the exception of one, Colonel William Campbell from Virginia. So they voted him our overall commander. We took to the saddle that morning and went thundering across the Catawba River. We was headed straight for him like a lightning bolt. We're going to put an end to this threat. We got right outside of Gilberttown, and the sky opened up on us. It began to pour down the rain. So we squatted under a group of cedar trees trying to keep our powder dry, praying that the rain would stop, but it didn't let up. So we pushed on. We got right outside of Gilberttown. We tied our horses up into the tree lines, took our rifles, and we moved in on foot. We went screaming out in that field where Ferguson was at. He was gone. There was nothing there but cold campfires. He'd been gone for 2 days. And even the best of the scouts couldn't find his trail. The ground was like a swamp. One of our commanders, a man by the name of Williams, spoke up and said, well, he's headed south. He's headed to that big British fort, Fort 96. So we turned and we started riding in that direction because we had to catch him. Now, the next night we was camped down on the Green River. In the middle of the night, I never heard such a commotion. A man come riding into our camp. Some of the boys drug him out of the saddle going to hang him, thought he was a spy. He said, my name's Colonel Edward Lacey. Take me up to see the commanders. So we drug him up to the commanders. Sure enough, that's who it was. Colonel Sevier knew him. Colonel Lacey asked him, sir, where you boys going? He said, we're riding toward Fort 96. We got to catch Patrick Ferguson. He said, I don't know where you got your information, but you're riding the wrong way. Ferguson ain't headed to Fort 96. He's headed to Charlottetown to get reinforcements from Cornwallis. And now we got scared, because we all knew, we knew good and well, if he got reinforcements, none of us would ever cross the mountains again. So Lacey had a group of Patriot fighters camped a few miles from us. He agreed to meet us the next day at a place called the Cowpens. We got up that morning and we rode 29 miles that day in the pouring rain. We come riding into the Cowpens. Colonel Lacey was there with his men. Now, the Cowpens was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area, graze them on that good grass, and then he'd pay men to drive them north to Philadelphia and sell them. We come riding in there. We hadn't had a bite to eat since we left Quaker Meadows. And I can honestly say that none of us were a thief. But I remember hearing the Reverend Oak say one time, the Lord helps those that help herself. So that's what we did. We helped ourselves to that man's beef. Didn't think he'd care a whole lot because we was all starved. And every one of us had a rifle. And that was the best meal we'd had in days. And as we sat there in the pouring rain that evening, once again the commanders had met, made a decision. They come walking through our camps that evening and they started picking out 900 of the best men. They picked out 900 of the best horses that we hadn't rode into the ground chasing Ferguson. And I'll never forget it. At 9 o'clock at night, we took to the saddle. We rode off in the dark in the pouring rain looking for Ferguson. All night long we rode through the darkness. Couldn't see the horse in front of you, but we wouldn't let up. We crossed the Broad River in the middle of the night. It was completely flooded. We put our strongest horses downstream in case anybody washed out of the saddle. There was nothing going to stop us. Now, the next morning, we rode up on a little homestead, a little house. Had a young man traveling with us. Enoch was his name, Enoch Gilmer. Little Enoch said, I got an idea. He's telling the commanders, if you let me ride over to that house, I'll find out where Ferguson's at. So we laid back in the woods and little Enoch rode across the fields, rode up to the house, tied his horse off, walked up on the porch, knocked on the door, and there were two women living there. Little Enoch looked as mean as he could. He said, I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army. So one of the ladies said, well, I know exactly where he's at because we took him eggs. He's on Kings Mountain. Now the men give Enoch just about enough time. They figure he found out what they needed. They busted in the door, grabbed little Enoch, going to hang him as a traitor. And them women commenced to squalling, well, don't hang him, he's just a boy. One of the men spoke up and said, well, not to offend these lovely ladies, let's take him down the road and hang him. So they drug him out of the house where the women couldn't see him. Commanders called him up, said, Enoch, did you find Ferguson? He said, yeah, he's on Kings Mountain. So now we knew exactly where he was at. And we was riding harder than we'd ever ridden because this threat was going to end, and it was going to end today. You know, about lunch, a lot of the men were starting to wear down and they wanted to stop and rest. And I can remember like it was yesterday. Old Isaac Shelby come riding right through our lines. He said, rest. I will not rest until I ride through the lines of Cornwallis himself. He fired us up and we kept riding. Now, right before 3 o'clock, by the grace of God, the rain stopped and we were at the bottom of Kings Mountain. William Campbell and them boys from Virginia took the front of that little mountain. Isaac Shelby and the boys from the Holston settlement went around this side. Lacey, other commanders took the back. Colonel Sevier took all us boys from the Watauga. We went around this side of the mountain. We had him. He wasn't going anywhere. We hit that mountain the first time and they pushed us back. We hit that mountain the second time. We went a little further, but once again they pushed us back. But the third time we hit that little mountain, we went almost to the top. We was so close on them, some of our boys was fighting with their knives and tomahawks against their bayonets. We hit that mountain the third time. You know, a lot of us older men remember when the Cherokees would attack the settlements. Man, they'd come screaming out of them woods. It would make your hair stand up. It'd make your skin crawl. So as we hit that mountain the third time, we were screaming our heads off like the Cherokee. But not only were we screaming like the Cherokee, we were fighting like the Cherokee because we had learned well. We was hiding behind the trees and rocks. We'd step out and fire and step back in and reload. And like I said, we went almost to the top. And sure enough, there was Ferguson. He was on a big white horse. Had his saber in one hand, 2 silver whistles. He was riding back and forward on that little mountain, blowing those whistles, barking out commands to his men. You know, a lot of his boys seen that we was overrunning them. They'd try to raise up a white flag. Ferguson come riding by and just cut it down. Now, to this day, I can't tell you if he's trying to escape. I can't tell you if he's trying to rally his men. But what I can tell you for a fact is, he got too far on the south side of that little mountain that day, and he ran smack into John Sevier and us boys from the Watauga. I was standing behind a big white oak tree. Every time I stick my head around to shoot, the bark would fly off. I could hear all the lead rifle balls as they whistled by me. The air was completely full of gun smoke. Couldn't even see who we was shooting at, but we wouldn't let up shooting. There was a young man over from me that day. John Gilliland was his name. Little John had been wounded 3 times. He was still at the top of that mountain. I heard him say, "Here comes Ferguson." He raised his rifle and he took a real careful aim. And when he pulled the trigger, it went click, it misfired. But there was an older gentleman over from him that day. Everybody in the settlement knew this man. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. Now, for you folks that don't know, Robert named his rifle after his wife, Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary, he called her Sweet Lips, because that's what he called Mary. I seen old Robert raise that rifle. He took a real careful aim. I heard him say, "We'll see what Sweet Lips can do." And when he pulled that trigger, bam, Ferguson came out of the saddle. But his foot was hung in the stirrup and his horse spooked. You know, by the time the boys got his horse stopped, he had 8 more holes through him. Ferguson told his men when he got to Kings Mountain, he said, "God Almighty and his angels won't take me off this mountain." He didn't realize how right he was, because that's where we left him. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day were killed or captured, and they were 28 patriots that never seen the sunset. We camped at the bottom of that little old mountain that night, and to this day I can hear the sounds of the wounded and the dying. The next day we started marching the prisoners north toward the Yadkin River. A few days later we sent some boys marching them on, the rest of us turned and headed back over the mountain. You know, it took about a week for Cornwallis to find out we whipped old Ferguson so bad. But when he found out, well, he started retreating. Had no idea where this band of rabble he called us, this over mountain army, had went to. As a matter of fact, the last we heard of Cornwallis, old Nathaniel Green and Dan Morgan was running him ragged all over the mountains, and he was headed back toward the coast. But us over mountain men, we went back home. We went back over the mountain to raise our crops and to raise our family. But we didn't know it at the time. But the most important seed we ever planted was that day on that little old mountain. Because within an hour and 5 minutes, we planted the seed of freedom. Because what we did that day, it was nothing short of a miracle. Because there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted. Hunters and farmers volunteered to the last man. We stopped and we forced the retreat of the most powerful army in the world, and then we went home.